I usually start off with a civic segment, which is what I'm going to be doing today. But before I do that, I'm going to just do a quick little review for how we got to what I'm going to start covering today. So we've been going through some of the founding documents from the 1770s and 1780s to kind of give you an idea of how the founding fathers kind of set up the government and how they thought the government was supposed to work. And I'll talk a little bit about later shows how it didn't work the way they thought it was going to work. But so in previous shows, and you can go back and listen to them if you like, we have talked about the Declaration of Independence, where you start seeing the word United States in a document. Before that time, you didn't really see them calling themselves the United States. And in the Declaration of Independence, they lay out a number of reasons for separating from England and trying to justify to other countries why they were declaring independence so they could get money from them and arms for them to fight against Great Britain. So after they did the Declaration of Independence, they had to form a new government at the national level. So we talked about the Articles of Confederation, where basically that is the government that got us through the Revolutionary War and the aftermath. But the Articles kept too much power with the state governments, which became a problem. So on a previous show, I went through some of those problems, particularly with no taxing power. And they started having problems maintaining order, which is, as I mentioned before, one of the reasons that you have a government is to maintain the order. So basically, the Founding Fathers decided to ditch the Articles of Confederation, and they had a constitutional convention to come up with a replacement for it. And that's something that I covered last week, was a constitutional convention. So they wanted to have a stronger national government, but not too strong because, they recently separated from England. So now that was kind of the balancing act that they needed to cover. So we're going to be covering the Constitution today. But I'm just going to give like a general overview of the articles that are in there, just very basic. And then in future shows, I'm going to go into more detail about what they actually say and whether it actually works the way that it's supposed to, and some of the problems that it has arisen under it. So we're going to be spending some time on the Constitution. So basically, the main difference, if you will, from the Articles of Confederation to the Constitution is, under the Articles of Confederation, basically you had the Confederacy of States, and the states still had the power. Well, under the Constitution, they totally changed that to forming a republic, where the people have the ultimate power, but we represent our elected officials to run the government for us or on our behalf. That was one of the big switches between them. So, and with the Constitution, this was like the first time it was done in the world. So they were, the Founding Fathers, you got to give them credit for going out where no one else had gone before. And this is what they came up with. So the Constitution started with the preamble, which we covered in, again, I mentioned that in an earlier show because it has some of the purposes of the government in there. So the preamble is just one long sentence with a bunch of commas in it. So I'll just go through it here with you again. It says, we the people. Now notice it says people here, whereas under the Articles of Confederation it said states. So this was the big change, one of them here. In order to form a more perfect union, because the union had not been working so well, establish justice, one of the purposes of government, ensure domestic tranquility, again another purpose of government. They were having trouble with this. Provide for the common defense. They needed a national army, that they didn't really have one under the Articles. Promote the general welfare, meaning making life better for the citizens of the United States. And secure the blessings of liberty. So there's one of the purposes of government. to ourselves and our posterity, meaning future generations, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. So that's the preamble. Pretty basic things. You probably learned that in elementary school or middle school, perhaps. So from there, the Constitution then moves into 7 articles. So, Brett, did you read the Constitution at any school that you attended?
I definitely did back in high school for my government class my senior year. Definitely remember that from good old Professor Steve Swazinski,
right,
who's now in the state legislature. Yeah, we definitely went all through the Constitution.
Okay. So there is a lot of people who have no idea what's in the Constitution and haven't been taught that. But if you're in my class, you're going to be reading through it and actually be writing a paper on it too. So I'm going to briefly go through the 7 articles. So the first 3 cover the 3 branches of government. Okay, so Article 1 is the legislative branch, which is Congress. Article 2 is the executive branch, which is the president and the federal agencies that he controls. And the 3rd article is the judicial branch. So this is basically the Supreme Court and the federal judicial system. Article 1 on the legislature is by far the longest article in the document. The founders thought that the legislative branch would have the most power. So you'll see when we go through it later that they put in specific powers in there for Congress to have. They put some powers in there that Congress cannot have. They put some powers in there that the states cannot have. So, I mean, there's all these different sections where they list the powers or non-powers to certain entities under the Constitution. I mentioned last week about how they came up with the Great Compromise, where they came up with 2 houses of Congress. So you have the House of Representatives is one, and you have the Senate, which is the other one. Those 2 make up Congress. So Article 1 lays out, there's a section in there about the House. And then there's a separate section in there about the Senate. So that's why Article 1 is the longest one by far. Plus, a lot of the Founding Fathers were in the legislatures in their states. Or some of them were in the legislature under the Articles of Confederation. So they had experience with this sort of stuff. So it was probably a little easier for them when they were writing up the Constitution to do this section, rather than some of the other articles, as we'll see, are definitely not as long as this one. So Article 2, then, it's the second longest section, and this deals with the executive branch, and that means basically the president and the executive agencies that are underneath the president, since he runs them. It also contains the Electoral College. So this is something that is in place only for presidential elections. And I'll be talking about this later before November when the election comes up. But this is where the Electoral College is in the Constitution. It also lists the powers and the duties of the president. Now, they are 2 different things. And also contains the section in the Constitution dealing with impeachment is in there. Article 3, then, is on the judicial branch. And this one's pretty short. Basically, what they did is they established the Supreme Court. So they actually said that in the first section under Article 3. And then they basically said, well, Congress, you can set up the rest of the court system. They lay out the jurisdiction of the federal court system. Jurisdiction meaning the ability to hear cases. So if a court does not have jurisdiction, they cannot hear your case. So they put in there the jurisdiction of the federal courts, and also some about the Supreme Court is in there. And then the last part defines what treason is. Article 4 then deals with relations among the states. And this one's even longer than Article 3. So one of the problems that the Articles of Confederation has was basically you had 13 different states and you had 13 different governments. You had 13 different economies. Right? So Article 4 here is an attempt to kind of make it a little easier for the national government to deal with state governments and for states to have their laws and their court decisions recognized by the other states. So that's part of what Article 4 does. And this is, under the first part, it talks about the full faith and credit clause. And that's where the Constitution says that other states have to abide by other states' laws and rights of their citizens and those sorts of things. Now, sometimes there are disagreements, of course, and they end up in court, but that's part of Article 4. Another part of Article 4 is how states get into the Union. So that's an important part. So, we started out with 13, and now we're up to 50, and now there's some arguments being made by the Democrats to add Puerto Rico and Washington, D.C. as states. So there's a procedure that you got to go through, and that's in Article 4. And Article 4 also says that if you are a new state and you get admitted, you have to have a republic. You have to follow the government that is already in place. You can't have your own other kind of government. So you got to follow they call it the Republican form of government, but what they mean is a republic. So we all 50 states at this point, we all operate under the same type of government at the national level. State governments, different types of things, but at the federal level, it's the same. Article 5. This is an important one because this is the one that deals with how you amend the Constitution. There's big disagreement on this one over whether the Founding Fathers made it too hard to amend the Constitution. So that's something I'll talk about when I cover Article 5. But that's where it is located in the Constitution. Basically, Congress, 2/3 of Congress, or 2/3 of the state legislatures can propose constitutional amendments. And then 3/4 of the state legislatures, or 3/4 of the state, if you have a national convention, need to ratify those proposals before they become an amendment. So that's pretty hard given today's political environment. Article 6 deals with the Supremacy Clause. I mentioned that last week, where the Supremacy Clause basically says that where there's conflicting state and federal laws, the feds win, the states lose. The feds are supreme. When it comes to the national, like congressional laws and treaties and the U.S. Constitution, they're supreme to state laws that conflict with them. Of course, one of the big issues in those cases are, well, do they really conflict or not? Article number 7, the last one, the shortest one. This one basically says, well, 9 out of the 13 states, through having state conventions, need to ratify the Constitution before it becomes implemented. So you needed 9. That didn't take very long, as it turns out. Eventually, all 13 did ratify it. And if you look at the original Constitution, you'll see that at least the people that were there at the end of the convention signed off on this document. But some people think that, well, they signed off on it and then it was legal. No, 9 out of the 13 states still had to ratify it. So the original Constitution was adopted in 1788 by 11 of the states, so by then it was legal. In June, actually, is when the ninth state adopted it. As it turns out, 3 of the states at their conventions actually adopted it unanimously, which is kind of surprising. Delaware was one, New Jersey was the second one, and Georgia was the third one. Only one state originally defeated it. In other words, said, no, we're not going to do this. And that was North Carolina. But they later had another vote later in 1789 and passed it. 2 states that passed it, it was really close. So when New York passed it, it passed by 3 votes. And when Rhode Island passed it, it passed by 2 votes. So, as I mentioned before, part of the deal to get the Constitution was to do a Bill of Rights proposed by the first Congress in 1789. So these are the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. 2/3 of the first Congress, meaning the House and the Senate, proposed them, and then the states ratified them by December of 1791, when Virginia was the 9th state, and then they became effective. So the Bill of Rights technically is not part of the original Constitution, but it was the first 10 amendments that was added pretty close to it. It was added within 3 years. So during the debates to ratify, both sides wrote newspaper articles to try and convince the delegates to pass it or not pass it. You may have heard of the Federalist Papers. Okay, this is when the people who wanted the Constitution adopted, wrote articles in the newspapers. That was basically the main way they did things back then. So James Madison wrote about 1/3 of them. Alexander Hamilton wrote 2/3 of them, and then John Jay wrote 5 of them. There were 85 total for the Federalist Papers, or the people who are wanting the Constitution passed. Federalist number 10 and Federalist number 51 are 2 of the most famous ones. Those were both written by Madison. Number 10 lays out why we should have a republic. And number 51 deals with the separation of powers and the checks and balances that we have, and why he argues the government should work slowly. On the other hand, the anti-federalists, those are the people who opposed the ratification of the Constitution. They also wrote 85 essays to counteract them, are the ones written by the Federalists, or in the Federalist Papers. So some of those people were Samuel Adams, Richard Henry Lee, Patrick Henry, George Mason, and Elbridge Gerry. So one thing to note here, even though the Anti-Federalists lost, they didn't stand in the way of the new Constitution taking over. They didn't have an insurrection. Okay? They accepted the loss. But they still got a lot of what they wanted, at least when the Bill of Rights came out. So, too bad that at least the Republican Party these days don't act like the Anti-Federalists did, where they accepted defeat. We'll see what the Republicans do, and hopefully the Democrats win in November. You have been listening to Politics Matters with Bruce Klopfleisch. How civics, politics, and law affect you. We'll talk to you again on the other side of this break.